Thank you for joining our webinar on the balance system. The balance system is a whole system strategic approach to supporting children and young people with a whole range of needs, but it primarily has come out of work in the area of speech, language and communication. And that's the area I'm going to focus on today. My name is Marie Gascoigne, and the balance system framework is something I've been working on for over 15 years now. And so what I'm going to tell you about today is an overview of what it is and how it's come about and how it's evolved, explain how it's currently being used by a whole range of stakeholders, including commissioners from all disciplines and providers, particularly of therapy services. So to get started, let's have a look at the framework itself. So it's had various different diagrammatic representations over the years. It started off as a very clear seesaw type model, hence the balance system linking with the visuals. And it's become this rather slightly more complex model now because as we've gone on, as I've gone on working with colleagues, it's become clear that there are certain key things which weren't in the original version which needed to be brought in. And if we start at the very bottom, it's getting the conceptual idea right, that we have to start with getting the right outcomes commissioned for children and families. And in the current legislative context, that increasingly means jointly commissioned where possible. So asking various constituencies who have money, who have responsibility for making sure that services are available, to actually look at doing that together and setting clear outcomes that they share for children, young people and their families. The next kind of core building block at the bottom is that whatever it is, whatever these outcomes are, to achieve them, we need an integrated workforce. And again, that's been an emerging theme over the last decade or so, that actually there's a recognition that you can't actually, as a professional, achieve something just from your professional perspective on your own. It invariably involves working with colleagues and indeed with families themselves. And then immediately above that, we indeed have the parents and carers as a core set of partners in these building blocks that underpin any whole systems approach. And so really recognising that core role. Sitting immediately above that, we start to transition towards the actual service delivery model, if you like. And we've made a fulcrum of leadership and management, and that sometimes surprises people as why that's features so strongly right at the centre of the model. But in fact, over numerous reviews, going right the way back to studies in 1999-2000, looking at collaboration around speech and language services, there was something about leadership and management that was very hard to quantify and perhaps evidence in a formal way, but that there was certainly a clear trend that where there were local champions and where there were good and strong leaders and supported leaders, services had flourished. And where that wasn't the case, then the opposite, sadly, was also true. And so we want to just really recognise that and emphasise the importance of that in the middle of the model. Sitting on top of it all is the service delivery framework itself. So we have training and development as a core plank, which underpins all that goes above. And then we have the universal targeted and specialist levels of support, which are delivered together by a wider workforce and a specialist workforce. And that very clearly they're both needed at all levels, albeit their roles might be different and specifics of what they do might be very different at the different levels. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. Okay. Now, sitting alongside that, over the last few years, what's become clear to me is that there are these 5 strand areas that the outcomes that we develop and that we include in any framework have to cover. So these 5 strands start, and in fact they started for me as concentric circles with the family in the middle, but I didn't quite capture it properly, so we've ended up with these strands sitting on top of each other. But we start at the top with family support, so actually supporting families, children, young people themselves as they get older, with information, with skills and with advice to actually make decisions and build resilience and be in charge of the situation in which they find themselves. We then move on to think about the environments in which they exist, whether that be the home, whether that be community environments, school learning environments, etc. And that these, in an ideal world, need to be audited, adapted and enhanced to actually allow children and people with speech, language and communication needs, or indeed other needs if we were looking at it through a different lens, to actually access and participate as much as is possible. And then as part of that, or moving on from that, we need the workforce, as I've already mentioned, to be appropriately skilled. And for that, we need to acknowledge the fact that there are specialists in the workforce. We have to make sure that there are enough specialist competencies in a skill mix, but that also there is this knowledge transfer and capacity building going on, so that the wider workforce is continually being refreshed and renewed with skills that they need in order to support packages around children and young people. And then we come on to identification and intervention. I think the point to make is that they sit as 2 of the 5 strands, but only 2 of the 5 strands. Whereas intuitively, I think historically certainly, the focus has been on intervention in particular, and to a slightly lesser degree identification. And so what the model is saying, a core principle of the model, is that actually identification and intervention are only as effective as they are within that whole system, and acknowledging that there has to be a context of a family, environments and workforce in which they happen. So our identification needs to be as efficient as possible and as accessible as possible. And that involves making sure that people in that wider workforce have support to know what to look for, to bring the right children through, but also that we don't put unnecessary barriers in the way of access to services. If we can look at something and see very quickly something that will help, we should be able to move through to that, even if we also think there are elements that need perhaps a little bit more delving, that we need to just think a little bit more about why we do our identification, what's it for. And what's it for is to obviously to respond to needs that is identified with intervention. And so we need our interventions to be appropriate and timely. And it doesn't matter whether they're direct, indirect, individual, group, that they need to be functional. There needs to be a core functional purpose. We know from the outputs from, for example, the Better Communication Research Programme, that what families value is things that they can see are making a difference in their child's life in terms of their well-being, in terms of their confidence, in terms of their participation, whilst accepting the importance of working on other areas, but actually those outcomes are what matter to families. Okay, now if we then think about how we might measure what we do, what we've done here is taken the Friedman model, which is well documented, an American economist, Friedman, and actually taken the grid from Friedman, the quantity, quality, effort and effect grid, but given a layer of language that's more appropriate to our needs into describing what the different quadrants are about. So if we start with level 1, which is terminology that I've introduced as part of this work, it's saying level 1 is an input measure. It's about measuring how much we did. So that's our traditional measures of input. So face-to-face contacts, etc. And they have a value. They tell commissioners and contract managers that something happened, but they don't actually tell us whether it made any difference. And that's a key leap that we want to think about a bit more, and are thinking about with the commissioners that we're working with at the moment using this framework. If we stay with the quantity side, we go down to think about reach, level 2. So this is still sticking with the notion of counting, but actually saying, well, okay, well, did we set a goal as to how many of these things we wanted to do for how many people and who those people are, and how well did we do in getting to that reach? So was it 100% reach of what we set out to do, or was it 80% or 70% or whatever? Which is giving a little bit more meaningful information, but it's still very much about the doing rather than the impact. We then move over to the quality side, and we have level 3 implementation, which is around the quality of what we've done. So was it good? Was it a good training? Was it a good and well-planned intervention? Now, sadly, the thing is, it can be excellent, but actually still not make any difference to the child or young person. And that could be for a whole host of reasons. And it's not being critical, it's saying that, well, actually, we need to recognise that that's a possibility in the mix and try and move to include, not all the time, because it simply would be unfeasible, but to try and include some measures that are about impact. So did we make a difference, and can we show that we made a difference, whether that be for an individual, whether it be for a group, such as a specific intervention group or a class or a school, or even going up to a population at a much broader level. And obviously the length of time that we will have to have those measures in place will vary depending on what it is we're trying to measure and at what level. Population measures notoriously will require trend data that might take a number of years to actually be available. So that's thinking about how we might build a measuring framework. Just want to say it's not about the tools. You could use a whole range of tools to actually get those measures. This is about making sure that at some point in the system there's a moment where one pauses and thinks, actually, are we thinking about that at all? Have we got a measure for that, or are we even setting out to measure that? Okay. And all of this comes together into this very busy diagram called the integrated solution tool. And because it's a very busy diagram, because this is essentially the front sheet of what started off and then became a Word document that went for some 40 or 50 pages of outcomes, we're in the process, and it's nearly complete, of translating this into an online platform where we can actually look at the outcomes and processes at all the levels in a much more interactive way, which makes it much more accessible. But just to describe the concept of what this is trying to do is to say, well, okay, if we want to look at a whole system, and in this case we're looking at it from the point of view of supporting speech, language and communication needs, if we look at the left-hand side, the purple columns, what we're saying is if we take those 3 levels, universal targeted specialist, and we take those 5 strands at each of those 3 levels, we need to identify shared joint outcomes across partners, health, education, etc., families themselves. We need to identify shared outcomes at each of those levels and for each of those strands. And once we've done that, we need to then work through, moving over to the pale green columns, we need to work through for each of those what the outcome, the overall outcome looks like, what the outputs might look like that would be the things that one would need to produce in order to achieve those outcomes, the likely tangible things that would need to be there, what the processes might be to actually make it happen, and this column particularly is personalised to the particular context and the particular area or service or whoever's using this from whatever angle. It has to be particularly personalised to get it right for the circumstances that it's being focused on. But then we have to also identify potentially 4 types of measure for each outcome. So an input measure, a reach measure, an implementation quality measure, and an impact measure. Okay, and then on the right-hand side, we have the dark green columns, which is where we try and specify who has to do what in order to achieve this outcome. And the first thing to say is there's a really core principle here, which you either agree with or you don't, but this is absolutely fundamental to this framework, which is that there isn't an outcome that can be achieved just by one element of this right-hand side. So there isn't an outcome that just speech and language therapists can solve. There isn't an outcome that just specialist teachers or EPs or health visitors or SENCOs can solve. There isn't an outcome that can just be solved by good teaching. There isn't an outcome that can just be solved by parents doing their best and working as hard as they possibly can. It actually needs a collaboration, and that collaboration will have a different mix and a different balance for each outcome at different levels. But there's a fundamental principle that there is always going to be that mix required. And so what you get sitting behind this, if you like, in this big Word document, which we're now moving to an online platform, is essentially for every one of those outcomes a worked through example which says, okay, so these are what you might see, this is how you might do it, this is how you might measure it, this is what you'll need from your speech and language therapist, this is what you'll need from your SENCO or your health visitor, this is what you'll need from your class teacher or your nursery nurse, this is what parents will need to do. And then the context column is about other things like space and capacity and perhaps support from senior leadership, etc. Okay, So before we go any further, just want to pause a moment and slightly as an aside, just think about how this all fits together in terms of the who does what and for whom. So on the left-hand side, we've got a population pyramid, and this is our population of children and young people. And if we use the research data that we have and some of the figures that are around in terms of what we can expect to find in a population in terms of different kinds of speech and language needs, the commonly used statistics at the moment would say that we can expect in any population of children and people to find around 1% with really quite severe, complex, long-lasting and specific speech and language needs. So needs that are going to need some sort of support over a period of time and are going to be long-lasting. We can expect to find a larger group that have more varied needs but that are still significant, perhaps 7 to 10% of a population. And into that larger group would also fit children and young people who have perhaps other primary needs, but speech and language and communication is part of. So you get a much broader group, but still a significant group. And then we have a much larger group, which is more varied and of needs that are potentially, or some obviously will go on potentially to be identified as having more significant needs, but we know that there are children who, perhaps through disadvantage or lack of early experience or various factors that are perhaps not as well understood as they will be in the future, there are associations in their circumstances which make them more likely to have speech and language needs, particularly in the early years. And so we have lower down that pyramid a larger group of children and young people, which will vary from situation to situation, but many of whom can be expected to actually respond well to support and to then essentially go down the pyramid to not having any needs, as opposed to travelling up if those needs are not addressed early. Okay, so moving to the middle then, we have our intervention pyramid, and I have been challenged about whether you can actually have a universal intervention. That's a fair point. So maybe we'll talk about universal offer and targeted and specialist interventions. But essentially, it's saying, okay, all the things that we do for children and young people in a whole systems approach, some of them are at the level of trying to enhance and manipulate the universal, the general environment that all young people exist in. Some will be about targeted interventions, and some will be specialist. And then there's an ongoing debate around where those lines are drawn between targeted and specialist and how we define those, which I won't go into today, but just to recognise there is a continuum of intervention support. And on the right-hand side, we have our workforce with, again, a range from the wider workforce, which is absolutely everybody, through to those that have developed enhanced skills in a particular area. In this case, we're thinking about speech and language needs. So you might have a teaching assistant that's completed a level 3 qualification in speech and language and developed lots of enhanced skills, through to the specialist workforce, the speech and language therapists, the specialist teachers, the EPs, etc. What I want to show you, though, is that we have a range of ways of travelling across these three pyramids. So we might have, for example, a quite complex child who sits in that 1%, but whose needs are appropriately met by targeted interventions at the moment, delivered by either somebody with enhanced skills or potentially even just through the wider workforce. At the same time, we might have a young person who has a less complex profile and perhaps sits further down that population pyramid, but for whom a specialist intervention delivered right now might actually be really effective and make all the difference. And in fact, potentially even be all that they're ever going to need. And equally, when we're looking at that universal offer and enhancing the universal provision that's out there for all children and young people, we might need specialists to be the people to be doing that, because they perhaps will have the better training and knowledge to actually impart their specialist knowledge in that wider context. What we want to avoid is an assumption that we go horizontally straight across these three pyramids. We do sometimes, obviously, and it's never say never, but that it shouldn't be the default. And that's not something that everybody's totally comfortable with, and it's just worth actually exploring that a little bit. Okay. So then moving on to think about what a journey might look like and what the provision itself might feel like. If we think about all of the things that might be in that, all the processes and outputs that might sit in that integrated solution tool running to its 60 odd pages in its two-dimensional format, we're talking about loads and loads and loads of units of activity that you could define as separate units. And for any child at any one time accessing any element of the service, they're likely to be maybe accessing 6 or 7 of those simultaneously, and they might be coming from all different levels. So just to illustrate, if we think about the 3 levels on this diagram here, and we've got the notion of time going from left to right, so things that are to do with pre-identification, so just information and awareness raising out there generally, things to do with identifying, which is more specific to specific individuals or groups, things around intervention, things around evaluation. So we might have something like the 2.5-year health visitor check, which is a universal identification activity. So it's happening out there for everybody, and it's definitely about identification. However, if we're thinking about that whole systems model, and we're thinking of it from a commissioning perspective, if the outcome is around identification, and the core component is that the health visitor does their 2.5-year check, the health visitor has to be supported at some level by training, by confidence in their own competencies to actually do that identification. And that will undoubtedly involve professional collaboration with speech and language therapy colleagues, or even training delivered by speech and language therapy colleagues. And those bits of the puzzle have to be funded and commissioned in order for the whole thing to work. But they need to be therefore identified as very clear components of what's needed in the bigger whole. We then think about a language-rich environment within a school or a nursery setting. So a health visitor might see a child at 2.5 and think, I don't think there's a speech and language therapy referral needed here, but they definitely would benefit from a little bit of experience and enrichment. So I'm going to direct the family to a setting that I know is particularly good at having a language-rich environment. Well, that language-rich environment won't have come about by accident. There will have had to have been at some point some staff training, some consideration of the environment and whether the environment is suitably enabling and communication friendly and so forth. And all of that has to happen, again, by some activity, and some of that might involve some training from the speech and language therapy service or from other colleagues, or bringing in materials that have been sourced that might be available nationally. But nevertheless, all of those things have to be there in order for it to happen. And then thinking more specifically, we might have a targeted intervention like a rolling programme of groups. So by this we mean where a service, for example, a speech and language therapy service, can predict that there are always going to be children that are requiring attention and listening support, vocabulary development, certain speech sound system issues that are common and are going to pop up. And so you might, rather than organising your service around who comes through the door, actually say, well, no, we know these are always going to be there, so we're going to set these up and have these there running. And very typically, in an ideal situation, you would be doing that collaboratively with schools and settings where those young people might be. And then we, of course, have situations where specialist intervention is what's required, and here the example is within a school setting. So you might have a specialist intervention going on, and indeed the child that's receiving that specialist intervention might also be receiving a rolling programme of groups or accessing a group in that programme. They may also be benefiting from a language-rich environment, and back in the day may have been identified by their health visitor. But all of that is really just trying to illustrate the fact that we need to think a little bit more flexibly. So what we don't want is for the pathways that we have to become silos. And so, for example, if a child in the identification part of this model were to be felt to need a specialist multidisciplinary assessment, which might require a little bit of a longer wait, if it was clearly obvious that they would also benefit from accessing something at a targeted level immediately, that should be possible. They shouldn't be sort of hived off into a pathway that becomes confining, as opposed to saying, great, there's something we can do in the meantime while we're moving forward towards that more complex identification. And it's just thinking a little bit more fluidly about things. Okay. So who's using the balance system framework at the moment, and how? So from a commissioning point of view, because that integrated solution tool and certainly the online platform, we're already starting to see how potentially useful that can be in ways that we hadn't even imagined when we were dealing with 2 dimensions and our large document. From a commissioning perspective, there are tools and templates to back up all of this, I suppose, to make it all happen, that are around needs assessment at a population level. That population could be defined at a local authority, it could level, so local authority CCG level, or health commissioning level, whatever that may be, or at a school level. Or you can define that population how you like, but they're typically the 2 sort of demographic levels that would be of relevance. So that allows us to look at what we predict what the need would be in an area based on an interaction between what we know about the population and what we know about the area itself in terms of key factors around the demographics. We can support through the model's development of specifications. In this instance, I've been talking about for speech language communication needs. So the integrated tool as itself is looking across the whole of the SLCN system. So it's including identifying what specialist teachers need to be doing, what class teachers need to be doing, and what speech and language therapists will be doing. And then what's increasingly the case is that a column, like the speech and language therapy column, if you like, can be taken out and made into the specification just for that service, acknowledging the fact that some services have to be commissioned unilaterally, and not always is it appropriate or possible to be commissioning around the whole area in one go, in one set of contracts. And increasingly, although it's not a focus for this webinar, these principles and these methodologies are being transferred to look at the commissioning of other therapies. From the provider side, the balance system framework offers a way of analysing your service provision, of if you feel that shows that there's a need to do something slightly different. It supports the service redesign. It supports allocation of resources across schools and settings, and of evaluating service provision using outcome-focused data. Tools for those outcome measures can be a whole variety. One of the core principles, again, of the whole framework and my philosophy is not to be prescriptive on the how. This is about defining the what, and the what has to happen, and the so what and the why, but the how can be absolutely flexible within certain parameters, but should be flexible. The support with stakeholder engagement potentially, and providing evidence for commissioners. And clearly where you get to a position, as we are in some areas, where you've got both the commissioners commissioning to the model and providers providing to the model, then it starts to generate its own set of a sort of next level up sophistication in terms of the 2 coming together. We also have the balance system scheme for schools, which I won't focus on in any great detail in this particular webinar, but that is essentially a version of the whole model which has been brought to and personalised to a school level. So it's a strategic approach for a school to support speech and language throughout the school across those 5 strands. So it's not a communication-friendly environment tool. It would require one to be in place, but that would just be about the enabling environment strand, if you like. It's about the whole 5 strands, the family support, enabling environment, workforce development, identifying and intervening. There's a formative process. It's a four-term cycle, or an academic year plus cycle if you're into semesters, with mentoring and online tools and support. And then, if desired, there's an accreditation which has been developed in conjunction with an applicant aphasic, and it completes step 3 of the Communication Trust Communication Commitment. So that's about all that I've got to say on this introductory webinar. There's some contact details there if anybody wants to get in touch with us, and thank you very much for your attention today.